In the chaotic final days before France's surrender to Germany in June 1940, one of the most extraordinary diplomatic proposals in modern history was put forward. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, offered France nothing less than a full political union between the two nations. Under this plan, every citizen of France would simultaneously become a citizen of Britain, and every British subject would become a citizen of France. The two countries would share a single government, a unified military command, and a joint parliament. It was, in the most literal sense, a proposal to merge two of the world's oldest sovereign nations into a single united country, perhaps in perpetuity. The fact that it was seriously considered at the highest levels of both governments speaks volumes about just how desperate the situation had become by mid-June 1940. Though the proposal ultimately failed and was rejected within hours of being offered, its brief existence offers a fascinating window into the politics of desperation. Germany launched its sudden, devastating Western offensive on May 10, 1940, and within weeks the French military, considered one of the most powerful armies in the world, was shattered. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics had destroyed French defensive lines, and by early June, Paris was under direct threat. The French government had already fled the capital, relocating first to Tours and then to Bordeaux. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud was desperately trying to hold his government together, but powerful voices within his own cabinet were pushing hard for an armistice with Germany. Churchill had made several trips to France during these weeks, trying to stiffen French resolve. He'd promised continued British support, but the reality was grim. Britain had just barely extracted its own expeditionary force from the beaches of Dunkirk, and it simply didn't have the resources to rescue France from the German onslaught. What Churchill could offer, however, was something far more radical than reinforcements. He could offer union. The concept of a Franco-British Union didn't spring fully formed from Churchill's mind alone. It had been circulating among a small group of officials and intellectuals for some time. Jean Monnet, the French political economist who'd later become known as one of the founding architects of the European Union, was one of the key figures behind the proposal. Monnet had been working in London as the head of the Anglo-French Coordinating Committee, a body established to manage the joint war effort. As France's military situation deteriorated, Monnet began working with senior British officials to draft a declaration of union. The idea also had support from Charles de Gaulle, who at that point was serving as France's Undersecretary of State for National Defense and War. The Declaration of Union, as it came to be known, was formally drafted on June 16, 1940. Its language was sweeping and unambiguous. It proposed that France and the United Kingdom would no longer be two nations, but one Franco-British Union. There would be joint organs of defense, foreign, financial, and economic policies. Both parliaments would be formally associated, and a single war cabinet would direct the combined war effort. The declaration also addressed the immediate military crisis. It stated that all the forces of Britain and France, whether on land, sea, or in the air, would be placed under the direction of the single war cabinet. The intention was clear. By merging the two countries, the proposal would make it politically and legally impossible for France to sign a separate peace with Germany. French territory might fall, but the French state itself would continue as part of a larger political entity, fighting on from London and from France's vast colonial empire. But as you can imagine, this idea was highly controversial, both from a British and a French point of view. It's worth noting that Churchill himself wasn't initially enthusiastic about the idea. When the concept was first presented to him, he was skeptical, reportedly dismissing it as impractical. The British War Cabinet discussed the proposal on the morning and afternoon of June 16th, and there was genuine debate about whether it was wise. Some ministers worried that they'd essentially be tying Britain's fate to a sinking ship, taking on France's enormous liabilities at a time when Britain's own survival was far from guaranteed. However, Churchill came around. Several factors seem to have influenced his thinking. First, there was the matter of the French fleet. France possessed one of the world's most powerful navies. There was a very real fear in London that if France surrendered, its warships would fall into German hands, potentially tipping the balance of naval power in Europe. The Royal Navy was the cornerstone of British defense, and the addition of the French fleet to Germany's Kriegsmarine would have created a serious naval threat. The Union proposal, if accepted, would keep the French fleet firmly under joint command and out of German reach. Second, Churchill recognized the symbolic power of such a gesture. Even if it didn't save France militarily, it would demonstrate to the world, and particularly to the United States, that the democracies were prepared to make extraordinary sacrifices. By the afternoon of June 16th, Churchill had given the proposal his full backing and telephoned Reynaud to relay the offer. Reynaud received the offer with cautious optimism. He reportedly felt that the declaration of union could give him the political leverage he needed to keep France in the war. He was facing something of an internal revolt at the highest level in his government, and his government and the entire French state were on the verge of total collapse. The cabinet was full of defeatists, such as Field Marshal Philippe Pétain, who were already likely scheming to maintain their power in a post-occupation France. When he presented the proposal to his ministers that evening in Bordeaux, the reaction was overwhelmingly hostile. Pétain reportedly called it a scheme to reduce France to the status of a British dominion. Some ministers expressed suspicion that Britain was simply trying to get its hands on France's colonial empire and fleet. The depth of anti-British sentiment within the French cabinet at that moment is striking, but perhaps not surprising. Many French officials felt deeply betrayed by what they perceived as insufficient British military support during the battle for France. There was bitterness over the British decision to evacuate from Dunkirk, which some French leaders saw as an abandonment of their ally at the most critical hour. There was also a long history of Anglo-French rivalry and mistrust stretching back centuries that couldn't simply be wished away by a declaration, no matter how dramatic. The proposal was rejected, and Reynaud, unable to hold his government together, resigned that same evening. He was replaced by Pétain, who immediately sought an armistice with Germany. Within days, France had officially surrendered. Historians have long debated whether the Franco-British Union could ever have been more than a gesture. The practical obstacles were enormous. The two countries had different legal systems, different languages, different currencies, and very different political traditions. Merging them into a functional state in the middle of a war, with one partner already under enemy occupation, would have been a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. The proposal also raised serious constitutional questions about whether Parliament could simply merge with France and more than double the size of the theoretical citizen base. If the deal was truly as equal as suggested, it would have been theoretically possible for French interests to completely dominate the United Kingdom. This seems like a recipe for extreme civil unrest during one of the most trying times in British history. However, it's perhaps more likely that this would have weakened French resistance on the home front. After all, in actuality, it's hard to imagine the Franco-British Union as proposed, while the French government was literally collapsing as fully equal. This merger may have actually emboldened collaborators and may have allowed the Vichy government to more effectively claim to be the legitimate government of France. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that the proposal didn't need to work perfectly to have served its purpose. Its primary goal was to keep France in the war, and even a partial or symbolic union might have achieved that. Had Renault accepted the declaration and used it to rally enough political support to continue, the entire course of the war could have been different. France's colonial possessions in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia represented enormous strategic resources. Keeping them actively in the fight would have significantly complicated Germany's strategic position. It also would have denied the Axis powers access to vital French colonial resources and bases that they later exploited to considerable advantage in several theaters of the broader conflict. Although the Franco-British Union never came to pass, its legacy is more significant than many people realize. Jean Monnet, who'd been one of its chief architects, carried the idea of supranational political integration forward into the post-war period. The European Coal and Steel Community, which Monnet helped establish in 1951, and its eventual evolution into the European Union, can trace itself back to the conservations of June 1940. The notion that European nations might pool sovereignty in the interest of peace and mutual prosperity didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was forged in the fires of the Second World War, and the Franco-British Union proposal was one of its earliest expressions. On the evening of August 31st, 1939, a small group of German operatives stormed a radio station in the border town of Gleiwitz in Upper Silesia. They broadcast a short, inflammatory message in Polish, left behind the body of a man dressed in a Polish uniform, and disappeared into the night. Within hours, the Austrian leader would use this manufactured provocation as justification for launching the invasion of Poland. By dawn on September 1st, the Wehrmacht was crossing the border, and the Second World War had begun. The Gleiwitz incident remains one of history's most brazen false flag operations, a calculated act that helped set the stage for the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen. To understand why this false flag operation occurred as it did, it's necessary to examine some of the key events leading up to it, at least briefly. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, and the seizure of the Sudetenland had all proceeded without significant resistance from the Western powers. In March 1939, Germany successfully functionally annexed the remainder of the Czech lands into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Each success emboldened the regime further. By early 1939, attention had turned firmly toward Poland. The regime wanted the free city of Danzig, the strategically vital Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Ultimately, the complete subjugation of Poland itself was the goal, as part of the Third Reich's vision for Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. Poland, however, wasn't going to simply hand over territory the way Czechoslovakia had been pressured into doing. The Poles had a guarantee of military support from both Britain and France, formalized in a mutual assistance pact signed in the spring of 1939. The Austrian knew that an outright, unprovoked invasion would almost certainly bring the Western Allies into the war, before he was ready for a broader European conflict. The diplomatic situation was further complicated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939. This secretly divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence and guaranteed that the Soviet Union wouldn't intervene on Poland's behalf. With the Eastern Front secured, the Germans only needed to manage the optics for the Western democracies. What was needed was a pretext, something that would make it look like Poland was the aggressor, and Germany was merely responding in self-defense. This is where the idea for a series of staged border provocations came in, and the Gleiwitz incident became the most notorious among them. The Gleiwitz attack didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a larger covert operation known as Operation Himmler. This umbrella plan, overseen by Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, involved multiple staged incidents designed to create the appearance of Polish aggression against Germany. These included attacks on German customs posts, acts of sabotage, and the planting of evidence to suggest that ethnic Poles were conducting hostile operations on German soil. The planning for these operations began months before the actual invasion. Heydrich delegated the specific task of the Gleiwitz radio station attack to Alfred Naujoks, a veteran intelligence operative. Naujoks later testified at the Nuremberg trials about his role, providing one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of how the operation was conceived and carried out. According to his sworn affidavit, Heydrich personally gave him the order sometime in August 1939, instructing him to stage an attack on the Gleiwitz radio transmitter. Naujoks assembled a small team of operatives for the mission. They'd been waiting in Gleiwitz for several days, staying at a local hotel and awaiting the final go-ahead signal. The code phrase that would set the operation in motion was a reference to a grandmother's death, received over a regular local radio broadcast. For days, the men stayed glued to the radio, having little idea when they were going to receive the coded message. When the signal came on the evening of August 31st, the team moved quickly. They seized the radio station at Gleiwitz, which was actually a small relay transmitter rather than a full broadcasting facility. The station, known as Sender Gleiwitz, normally rebroadcast programming from Breslau and was staffed by only a handful of employees. The operatives overpowered the staff on duty and then broadcast a short message in Polish. The exact content of the broadcast has been debated by historians, but it's agreed that it was essentially a brief, provocative announcement. It likely said that the station had been seized by Polish nationalists and that the time had come for Poles in the region to rise up against Germany and ethnic Germans everywhere. The entire broadcast lasted only a few minutes, and given the limited power of the transmitter, it's unclear how many people actually heard it in real time. To lend physical evidence to the scene, the operatives left behind a body. The victim left at the Gleiwitz station was Franciszek Honok, an ethnic Silesian farmer with Polish sympathies who'd been arrested by the Gestapo the day before. Historians believe that he identified as Silesian, a group that doesn't necessarily neatly fit into either Polish or German ethnic categorizations. He was given a lethal injection, shot to further simulate combat wounds, and left at the scene for authorities and journalists to find. His body was meant to serve as proof that armed Poles had both seized a piece of German territory and had engaged in a firefight with the German citizens at the station. The propaganda machine moved fast. By the morning of September 1st, German state media was already broadcasting reports of Polish aggression along the frontier. They cited the Gleiwitz attack and other staged incidents as evidence that Germany was under threat. The Austrian addressed the Reichstag that same day, declaring that Germany had been forced to respond to Polish provocations with military action. He didn't specifically name Gleiwitz in his speech, but the cumulative effect of all the staged border incidents was exactly what the regime had intended. They'd created a narrative of Polish hostility that, at least domestically, provided political cover for the invasion. It's worth noting that the international community wasn't really fooled, contrary to their hopes. British and French diplomats were deeply skeptical of Germany's claims from the very beginning. Intelligence services in both countries had been monitoring the situation closely and were aware that Germany had been preparing for an invasion regardless of any border incidents. Even within Germany, sophisticated observers recognized the incidents for what they were, but in a totalitarian state where dissent could mean death, there was no room for debate. The full details of the Gleiwitz incident and Operation Himmler didn't emerge publicly until after the Second World War. Alfred Naujoks, who'd eventually fallen out of favor with the regime defected to the Americans in October 1944, in a bid to save his own skin. His affidavit, submitted as evidence during the trial of major war criminals, laid out the operational details of the Gleiwitz attack in considerable specificity. Notably, some historians consider his account to be at least partially unreliable, as he had motive to downplay what happened, and the two architects of the attack were dead anyway. It's also worth noting that he was a criminal in his own right, who would be convicted of mass executions of Danish resistance members and a variety of civilians. Some believe that he was, in essence, telling the Allies what he believed they wanted to hear, in a bid to escape execution himself. If this was his plan, ultimately, it ended up working, and he received a minimal sentence, despite the truly horrific nature of the actions he committed during the war. The Nuremberg trials themselves treated the staged border incidents as part of the broader case against the leadership for crimes against peace. The prosecution demonstrated that the invasion of Poland had been planned well in advance, and that the border provocations were a premeditated element of the overall strategy. Documents recovered from German archives showed that military planning for the invasion, codenamed Fall Weiss or Case White, had been underway since at least April 1939. It was a cold, calculated conspiracy to create a false justification for military aggression, and the tribunal recognized it as such. Franciszek Honak, the man slain to serve as a prop at the radio station, remained largely forgotten for decades after the war. His story only gradually entered the broader historical record as researchers dug deeper into the specifics of the Gleiwitz operation. He's become something of a symbol of the individual human cost of state-level deception, an ordinary person whose life was ended to serve as a piece of staging in a propaganda exercise. The Gleiwitz incident is a story that deserves to be remembered, not because it was a brilliant piece of espionage, but precisely because it wasn't. It was clumsy, transparent, deeply disturbing, and in the end, it didn't fool the Western powers into believing Germany was engaging in a defensive war against Poland. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing element of the story is the individual human tragedy of Franciszek Honak. Despite his name being virtually completely unknown, his death would be the key to fabricating the cause to the start of the biggest conflict in human history. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to your friends and family who enjoy historical content. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. On the night of September 18th, 1931, a small explosion echoed along a stretch of railway track near Mukden in the Chinese region of Manchuria. The blast was minor, so insignificant that a train passed over the damaged section of track just minutes later without incident. But what followed that tiny detonation was anything but minor. Within hours, the Japanese Kwantung Army launched a full-scale military operation across southern Manchuria. It claimed it was acting in self-defense against Chinese aggression. In reality, the explosion had been carefully staged by Japanese military officers themselves. It was a calculated and deliberate act of sabotage designed to manufacture a convincing pretext for a full invasion. The Mukden incident, as it came to be known, didn't just change the map of East Asia. It set into motion a chain of events that would undermine the international order, expose the weakness of the League of Nations, and serve as one of the opening acts of the Second World War. By the early 1930s, Japan had maintained a significant military and economic presence in the Manchurian region for decades. Following its victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japan had acquired the leasehold of the Liaodong Peninsula and control of the South Manchuria Railway. This was a vital economic artery that ran through the heart of the resource-rich yet economically underdeveloped territory. It was the backbone of Japan's colonial infrastructure in the region, surrounded by mines, factories, agricultural operations, and Japanese settlements. This railway fed critical raw materials back to the resource-hungry Japanese home islands. Japan's interest in Manchuria was driven by both economic necessity and strategic ambition. The country was densely populated and resource-poor, and its leaders saw Manchuria's vast reserves of coal, iron, and arable land as essential to Japan's growth. At the same time, rising Chinese nationalism under the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek threatened to reassert Chinese sovereignty over the region. Boycotts of Japanese goods, disputes over railway rights, and increasing tensions between Chinese and Korean settlers further inflamed the situation. For many officers in the Kwantung Army, the military force tasked with protecting Japan's interests in Manchuria, the solution was obvious. They believed outright conquest was not just desirable, but necessary for the preservation and prosperity of the Japanese people as a whole. Interestingly, the plan to fabricate a crisis didn't come from Tokyo's civilian government. It was hatched by mid-ranking officers within the Kwantung Army itself, most notably Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishiwara and Colonel Seishiro Itagaki. Both men were ultranationalists who believed Japan's destiny lay in continental expansion. They both were deeply frustrated by what they saw as the weak-willed timidity of the civilian government. In their mind, this government was leading Japan towards a civilization collapse, not just of Japan, but of all Asian countries in perpetuity. They had concluded that a final decisive showdown between Eastern and Western civilization was destined, and only Japan had the ability to emerge victorious. In this view, securing Manchuria was the essential next step in preparing the Empire of Japan for that final clash of civilizations. The conspirators chose a section of the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, today known as Shenyang, as the site for their staged attack. On the evening of September 18th, a small quantity of dynamite was placed on the tracks and detonated. The explosion was deliberately kept minimal, enough to create evidence of sabotage, but not enough to seriously damage the railway. After all, the railway was absolutely crucial to Japanese interests in the region, and doing serious damage to it could have resulted in major political and personal fallout. Japanese soldiers stationed nearby immediately blamed Chinese troops garrisoned at a nearby barracks and launched a pre-planned assault. The speed and coordination of the Japanese military response made it obvious, even at the time, that this was no spontaneous reaction to an unexpected provocation. The Kwantung Army had troops, logistics, supply chains, and detailed operational plans already carefully in place, simply waiting for the signal to move. Within hours of the explosion, Japanese forces had seized Mukden and several other key cities along the railway corridor. Chinese troops in the region, following standing orders from the Manchurian warlord Zhang Xueliang, largely did not resist. Zhang, who had recently aligned himself with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, chose not to meaningfully engage the Japanese military. Over the following weeks and months, the Kwantung Army expanded its operations rapidly, pushing beyond the railway zone to occupy the entirety of Manchuria. The civilian government in Tokyo, led by Prime Minister Reijiro Wakatsuki, was caught off guard and initially tried to contain the military's actions. But the Kwantung Army's dramatic successes on the ground, combined with a wave of nationalist sentiment at home, made it politically impossible for the cabinet to rein in the military. By early 1932, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, as its nominal head of state. In practice, Manchukuo was entirely controlled by the Japanese military and served as a base for further expansion into northern China. In a turn of events that must have seemed quite unusual for anyone who potentially believed this was truly a Manchurian Confucian state, the Japanese did something quite unusual. They elevated Amaterasu, the primary goddess of Shinto and the legendary ancestor of Hirohito himself, to an official deity of this supposedly Chinese Manchu state. The symbolic implications of this were significant, since it was an official acknowledgement that the Japanese emperor's ancestor was to be worshipped by the last emperor of China. That said, the Japanese did attempt to maintain the fig leaf that this new state was quote-unquote independent, at least to a certain degree. Chinese, Manchurian, and Mongolian people were allowed to maintain civil service positions within the newly formed state. However, virtually all key roles were held by Japanese nationals, and those that weren't were held by people with extreme pro-Japanese leanings. China immediately appealed to the League of Nations, the international body that had been specifically established in the aftermath of the First World War to prevent this. The League's response, however, was painfully slow and ultimately ineffective. It dispatched the Lytton Commission, led by British diplomat Victor Bulwer-Lytton, to investigate the situation. The commission spent months traveling through the region, interviewing officials, and gathering evidence. At the time, the good faith belief was that the results of this investigation could be used to peacefully restore rightful order in the region. Its final report, published in October 1932, concluded that Japan's military actions were not justified as self-defense, and that Manchukuo was not a genuine independent state. The report recommended that Manchuria be returned to Chinese sovereignty under an autonomous arrangement that would still protect Japan's economic interests. Japan's response to the Lytton report was swift and defiant, and is seen as one of the first cracks in the post-Great War international order. When the League's General Assembly voted to adopt the report's findings in February 1933, the Japanese delegation walked out of the chamber. Diplomatic efforts continued to try to have Japan agree to the recommendations in the report, but unsurprisingly, these efforts came to nothing but wasted breath and ink. Japan formally withdrew from the League of Nations the following month, becoming the first major power to leave the organization. The incident exposed the League's fundamental inability to enforce its principles against a determined aggressor, especially one that was also a major military and economic power. Without the United States as a member and with Britain and France reluctant to confront Japan, the League had no mechanism to compel compliance. The message to the world was unmistakable. International institutions couldn't stop a nation willing to use force. The Mukden incident's consequences extended far beyond Manchuria. Within Japan, the military's successful defiance of civilian authority accelerated a dangerous trend toward militarism that would dominate the country's politics throughout the 1930s. The Kwantung Army's officers, far from being punished for acting without authorization, were celebrated as heroes. This emboldened the military establishment and encouraged further acts of political insubordination. This included assassinations and attempts against moderate civilian politicians and the steady, gradual erosion of democratic governance across the country. By the mid-1930s, Japan's military had effectively taken control of the country's foreign and domestic policy. It became absolutely clear that no one in the civilian leadership was willing to stand up to the military. Of course, this isn't surprising, given the extreme levels of violence officers were willing to use against politicians who weren't fully on board with their agenda. Further yet, this was a time period when Japan was suffering from winner's syndrome. The populace began to believe the propaganda that the Yamato people were built different, that they were a cut above all other people in the world. The idea that only the Japanese spirit could stand up to the Western powers became entrenched, an idea that would eventually cause catastrophic consequences for Imperial Japan. This belief, this winner's syndrome, would be one of the reasons why Japan, already embroiled in an unwinnable war with China, would choose to attack the United States. Internationally, the Mukden incident served both as a template for aggressive authoritarian nations and a warning for nations seeking peaceful coexistence. It demonstrated conclusively that a sufficiently bold and determined aggressor could present the world with a fait accompli and face no real consequences whatsoever. Historians have drawn direct parallels between Japan's seizure of Manchuria and later acts of expansionist aggression in the 1930s. The non-response may have been part of the inspiration for acts including Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. Each of these acts further eroded the credibility of collective security and brought the world closer to a general conflict. On the evening of November 8, 1923, a relatively obscure politician stormed into a beer hall in Munich and attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government. The event, now known as the Beer Hall Putsch, would fail spectacularly, but it would also produce one of the most revered relics in the history of the Reich. Among the roughly 2,000 men who marched through the streets of Munich the following morning was Heinrich Trambauer. He was a member of the SA who carried the company flag of his paramilitary unit. It was a simple banner, nothing particularly remarkable at the time. That changed when the marchers reached the Feldherrnhalle and were met by roughly 130 armed state police officers. While the exact true details of what happened next were obscured due to decades of propaganda, what is clear is that the heavily armed marchers began to clash with the police. Shots rang out, and in the chaos, 4 police officers and 16 coup plotters were slain. Trambauer was hit and dropped the flag. At that same moment, Andreas Bauriedl, an SA man marching alongside him, was fatally shot in the stomach and collapsed onto the fallen banner, soaking it in his blood. Just like that, an ordinary party flag was transformed into the Blutfahne, the blood flag. It would go on to become perhaps the most symbolically powerful artifact in the entire Third Reich mythos. What happened to the flag immediately after the putsch isn't entirely clear. There are 2 competing stories, and again, it's necessary to consider the level of myth-making around this event. The first holds that the wounded Trambauer managed to remove the flag from its staff, hide it inside his jacket, and later entrust it to a man named Karl Eggers for safekeeping. The second version claims that Munich police confiscated the flag along with other materials, and that it was eventually returned to the party through Eggers. An investigation conducted by archivists in the mid-1930s concluded that Trambauer had indeed been the flag bearer, and that the flag had been concealed rather than seized by police. However, given who conducted the investigation, it remains unclear if this was factual history or more propaganda and legend building. Regardless, the outcome was the same. After the Austrian was released from Landsberg prison in December 1924, having served just 9 months of a 5-year sentence for high treason, Eggers presented the blood-stained flag to him. He immediately understood the propaganda potential and had the flag mounted on a new ornate black staff. Just below it, a silver dedication sleeve was affixed bearing the names of the 16 men killed during the putsch. The flag was no longer attached by its original sewn-in sleeve, but instead by a red, white, and black intertwined cord. From that point on, the blood flag became central to some of the most elaborate rituals in the party repertoire. Jakob Grimminger was appointed its official and exclusive bearer, a role he'd hold for nearly 2 decades. He carried the flag at party rallies, putsch commemorations, funerals of high-ranking officials, and other significant events. One of the most striking uses of the flag occurred at the annual Nuremberg rallies, where the Austrian personally performed a ceremony known as the flag consecration. During this ritual, he'd grasp the Blutfahne in one hand and a newly issued party banner in the other, physically touching the two together. The idea was that the blood of the fallen martyrs would symbolically flow into the new flag, sanctifying it. It was pure theater, but extraordinarily effective theater. The flag was also used during ceremonies where newly conscripted SS men swore their blood oaths of loyalty. When it wasn't being paraded before crowds, the flag was kept under heavy guard. Initially stored at the party's headquarters in Munich, it had its own specialized guard, and was later stored in a specialized vault in that city when it wasn't in use. The Blutfahne was last seen in public on October 18, 1944, at the induction ceremony of the Volkssturm in Berlin. These were a civilian militia hastily assembled as the war turned decisively against Germany. Heinrich Himmler presided over the event, which was attended by several high-ranking officials, including Wilhelm Keitel, Heinz Guderian, and Martin Bormann. After that, this most sacred relic of a falling regime, which had taken the world and plunged it into chaos, simply vanished, never to officially be seen again. The most widely accepted theory is that the flag was destroyed during the Allied bombing of Munich in 1945. Large portions of the city were effectively completely destroyed, and a flag is naturally quite likely to be burnt up in any inferno. That said, what this theory lacks is any actual evidence that this actually happened, and some believe there would have been records kept to indicate its destruction. A second theory suggests that the flag was taken as a war trophy by American soldiers when they entered Munich. The U.S. Army captured enormous quantities of artifacts and memorabilia during the occupation. It's entirely possible that an individual soldier came across the flag, didn't recognize its particular significance, and simply took it home as a souvenir. If true, this flag could theoretically be sitting in an attic somewhere in the United States, its owner entirely unaware of what they possess. Another variant of this theory suggests that it was deliberately destroyed by American soldiers, though if this was the case, no official records provide any evidence. A third possibility involves the Soviet Union. The Red Army seized vast quantities of property and military artifacts during their push into Central Europe. Much of this was transported back to Moscow and stored in state repositories that remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers for decades. However, this theory is the most doubtful, as it would have been highly unlikely that party officials would have moved the flag to an area that could have come under Soviet control. Then there's the more dramatic theory that the flag was deliberately saved by loyal party members and smuggled out of Germany entirely. Some collectors and amateur historians have claimed the flag was spirited away to South America along the same rat lines used by fleeing criminals in the post-war years. Still others believe that it may have ended up in Franco's Spain, where someone may still be in possession of it today. These claims are largely anecdotal and unverified, but they persist stubbornly in certain collector circles. Finally, there's the question of Grimminger himself. As the flag's exclusive handler for nearly 2 decades, he would have been the person most likely to know, according to some theories. Grimminger survived the war and was tried by the Allies in 1946 for his role in the propaganda machine. He lived until 1969, dying in obscurity and poverty. Most historians believe he likely didn't possess the flag or know its ultimate fate, as he only had direct custody during official events. However, it's possible that he knew who took it or what became of it, though this was considered a low-priority issue, and it doesn't appear to have been properly investigated. Whatever knowledge he may have had, if there was any, he apparently took it to his grave. The disappearance of the Blutfahne remains one of the enduring minor mysteries of the Second World War. Whether it was destroyed in the bombing of Munich, taken home by an unsuspecting soldier, or smuggled to South America, nobody has definitively proved what became of it. For an object that held such enormous symbolic weight for one of history's most destructive regimes, perhaps its vanishing is fitting. When we talk about World War II, the mind often drifts to the beaches of Normandy, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, or the skies over Britain. But there's a theater of war that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, one fought across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The North African Campaign, which raged from 1940 to 1943, was a brutal, sprawling contest that stretched across Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. The campaign saw some of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. Armies chased each other back and forth across hundreds of miles of desert, fortunes shifting with the seasons, the supply lines, and the quality of leadership on the ground. The distances involved were staggering. From Tripoli in the west to Cairo in the east, the potential battlefront covered well over 1,000 miles of coastline. Much of it was bordered by nothing but open desert that stretched south to the Sahara. It produced legendary figures, devastating defeats, and hard-won victories that changed the trajectory of the entire war. This is the story of that fight. The North African Campaign didn't begin with Germany. It began with Mussolini's Italy. When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, Mussolini saw an opportunity to expand his colonial empire in Africa and assert Italy's place among the great powers. Italy already held Libya, and Mussolini had dreams of seizing Egypt and the Suez Canal, which would have given him control over one of the most critical shipping routes in the world. Control of the canal meant control over the fastest sea route between Europe and Asia, and whoever held it wielded enormous strategic leverage. In September 1940, the Italian 10th Army, under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, crossed the Egyptian border from Libya with a force of roughly 250,000 men. It was an enormous army on paper, but it was poorly equipped, poorly led, and deeply unprepared for what was coming. The British, under General Sir Archibald Wavell, had far fewer troops in Egypt, roughly 36,000 men of the Western Desert Force. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in training, equipment, and sheer audacity. In December 1940, Wavell launched Operation Compass, a limited counteroffensive that turned into one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. Over the course of 2 months, British and Commonwealth forces advanced over 500 miles, destroyed the Italian 10th Army, and seized the Libyan port of Tobruk. Somehow they also managed to capture well over 100,000 Italian soldiers in the process as well. The cost to the British was astonishingly low, sustaining around 2,000 casualties against those massive Italian losses. It was a catastrophe for Italy, a profound embarrassment on the world stage, and forced Germany's hand. In February 1941, the Austrian painter dispatched one of his most talented and aggressive commanders to salvage the situation in North Africa. His name was Erwin Rommel, and he arrived in Tripoli with a small but formidable force that would become known as the Afrika Korps. He'd been ordered to hold a defensive line and wait for reinforcements, but within weeks of arriving, he launched an offensive that caught the British completely off guard. The British had been weakened by the diversion of troops to Greece, and Rommel exploited this ruthlessly. By April 1941, he'd driven the British back across most of Cyrenaica and was pressing toward the Egyptian border. Only the stubborn Australian garrison at Tobruk held out, enduring a siege that would last over 240 days. Rommel's reputation grew rapidly. He was bold, unpredictable, and willing to lead from the front, sometimes dangerously so. He earned the nickname the Desert Fox for his cunning tactical maneuvers and his ability to outthink opponents who often had more resources than he did. Even his enemies respected him. Winston Churchill famously acknowledged Rommel's skill in the House of Commons, a rare tribute to an adversary during wartime. But Rommel's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His aggressiveness frequently outran his supply lines, and in the desert, logistics were everything. An army without fuel, water, and ammunition in the Sahara wasn't just stalled out temporarily, but quite literally dead. The Axis would find this out the hard way in the future, but for now, they were on the offensive, and stunningly so. From mid-1941 through mid-1942, the Desert War took on a back-and-forth character that was almost dizzying. The British launched Operation Battle Axe in June 1941, attempting to relieve Tobruk and push Rommel back. It failed. In November 1941, the newly formed British Eighth Army launched Operation Crusader. This was a much larger and more complex offensive that succeeded in relieving Tobruk and pushing Rommel back to El Agheila, roughly where he'd started. But Rommel wasn't finished. In January 1942, he counterattacked again, driving the British back to the Gazala line west of Tobruk. Then, in May and June of 1942, came the Battle of Gazala, one of Rommel's masterpieces. In a sweeping flanking maneuver, he shattered the British defensive line, captured Tobruk in a single day on June 21st, and took over 30,000 prisoners. It was a humiliating defeat for the British and one of the darkest moments of the war for Churchill's government. Rommel, now promoted to Field Marshal, pushed deep into Egypt, reaching El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria. It seemed as though Cairo itself might fall, and panic gripped the British headquarters in Egypt, with staff officers burning documents in what became known as Ash Wednesday. The fall of Egypt would have meant the loss of the Suez Canal, and potentially opened the door to Axis control of Middle Eastern oil fields. For the oil-starved Axis powers, this would have been a massive victory that may even have outstripped the benefit of controlling the Suez Canal. But Rommel's forces were exhausted, his supply lines were stretched impossibly thin, and the British were about to get new leadership that would change everything. In August 1942, Churchill made a command change that would prove pivotal. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took command of the British Eighth Army. Montgomery was Rommel's temperamental opposite, meticulous, methodical, and unwilling to attack until he had overwhelming superiority. He wasn't flashy, and he could be maddeningly cautious, but he understood something crucial about fighting in the desert. Victory didn't go to the boldest, it went to the best supplied and the most patient. With Monty, as he was called by his men, the British finally had a man on the ground who could match wits with the Desert Fox in this high-stakes chess game. Montgomery spent weeks building up his forces, training his men, boosting morale through personal visits to frontline units, and planning every detail of his counteroffensive. He insisted on having a significant numerical and material advantage before committing to battle, and he got it. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942 had already halted Rommel's advance. Then, in late August, Rommel made one last attempt to break through at the Battle of Alam el Halfa, but Montgomery was ready for him and repulsed the attack with minimal losses. The stage was set for the decisive blow. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein with a massive artillery barrage. The battle lasted 12 days and was a grinding, attritional fight through minefields and fortified positions. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. By November 4th, Rommel's forces were in full retreat. He'd lost over 30,000 men, along with vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and vehicles. El Alamein was the turning point. As Churchill later remarked, before Alamein the Allies never had a victory, and after Alamein they never had a defeat. That was, of course, a massive overstatement, but it captured the psychological shift brought on by the victory perfectly. Just days after El Alamein, on November 8, 1942, a massive Anglo-American force landed in French North Africa as part of Operation Torch. This was the largest amphibious operation the world had ever seen up to that point, and it was America's first major ground operation in the European theater. It was commanded by a relatively unknown general named Dwight D. Eisenhower. He'd been selected in part for his diplomatic skills and his ability to manage the complex relationships between Allied commanders. Under him was a famously far less diplomatic general, the legendary field commander George S. Patton. The landings took place at Casablanca in Morocco and at Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The political situation was enormously complicated. French North Africa was controlled by Vichy France, which was technically aligned with Germany. There was fighting at some of the landing sites, particularly at Casablanca and Oran, but within a few days, a ceasefire was arranged with the French authorities. Torch transformed the strategic picture entirely. Rommel was now caught between two massive forces, Montgomery's Eighth Army advancing from the east and the Torch forces pressing from the west meant that the Axis was playing not to win, but to lose as best they could. The Germans responded by rushing reinforcements into Tunisia, creating a new front that would see some of the fiercest fighting of the entire campaign. The Americans, in particular, had a steep learning curve dealing with battle-hardened soldiers. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, inexperienced American forces were badly mauled by Rommel's veterans, suffering around 6,500 casualties in just a few days of fighting. The final act of the North African campaign played out in Tunisia over the first 5 months of 1943. It was a complex, multinational affair involving British, American, French, and Commonwealth forces, closing in on an increasingly desperate Axis army. Rommel himself was recalled to Germany in March 1943, officially on sick leave, but in reality, because the Germans didn't want a field marshal captured on foreign soil. Command of the Axis forces in Tunisia passed to Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who inherited a deteriorating situation with no hope of reversal. The fighting in Tunisia was intense and markedly different from the open desert warfare that had characterized much of the earlier campaign further east. The terrain was far more varied, with mountains, valleys, and dense agricultural land that favored defensive operations. The Allies had to coordinate attacks across a broad front, and it wasn't always smooth. Friction between British and American commanders was a recurring problem, and the logistical challenges of supplying multiple armies operating in different sectors were immense. But the Axis position was ultimately untenable. Allied air and naval superiority meant that Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean were being destroyed at catastrophic rates. By April 1943, the Axis forces in Tunisia were starving for fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, with almost nothing getting through. The final Allied offensive began in late April, and it broke the Axis lines within days. The coordination between ground forces and overwhelming Allied air power was devastating, with Allied bombers roaming freely over Axis positions and supply routes. On May 7, 1943, British forces entered Tunis while American forces captured Bizerte. The Axis forces, now completely cut off, began surrendering en masse. By May 13th, it was over. Approximately 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, a haul of prisoners comparable to Stalingrad. It was a disaster of the first order for the Axis, and it cleared the way for the Allied invasion of Sicily and then mainland Italy. The numbers behind the North African campaign are staggering for what has generally been considered somewhat of a sideshow to the main action. Over the course of nearly 3 years of fighting, The Axis powers suffered an estimated 620,000 casualties. Allied casualties were lower but still substantial, with British forces bearing the heaviest burden in the early years and American forces taking significant losses in Tunisia. The campaign also had a devastating impact on the civilian populations of North Africa, whose homes, farms, and cities became battlefields through no choice of their own. Entire communities were displaced, infrastructure was destroyed, and the scars of war lingered in the region for decades after the fighting stopped. Beyond the raw statistics, the campaign's legacy shaped the rest of the war in ways that can't be overstated. It gave the Allies, and particularly the Americans, essential combat experience before the invasion of Europe. Commanders like Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery honed their skills in North Africa and carried those lessons into Normandy and beyond. The campaign also demonstrated the critical importance of logistics, intelligence, and inter-allied cooperation, lessons that would prove decisive in the campaigns to come. The North African campaign also had profound geopolitical consequences. It knocked Italy toward collapse, accelerating the fall of Mussolini's regime in the summer of 1943. It secured the Mediterranean for Allied shipping, freeing up millions of tons of shipping capacity that had been forced to take the long route around the Cape of Good Hope. And it demonstrated to the world, and to the Axis powers in particular, that the Allies could work together effectively and win decisively on the offensive. Today, the battlefields of El Alamein, Tobruk, Kasserine, and Tunisia stand as solemn reminders of what happened when the world's great powers collided in the sands of North Africa. The campaign lasted roughly 1,000 days and covered thousands of miles of some of the harshest landscape on the planet. It remains one of the most compelling and consequential chapters of the Second World War, and understanding the campaign for North Africa is key to understanding the conflict as a whole. It was May 5th, 1945, and the Battle of Castle Itter was about to earn its reputation as the strangest battle of the Second World War. The conflict pitted mortal enemies against a common foe, and it did so just 48 hours before Germany's unconditional surrender. American soldiers, German Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian resistance fighters, and French political prisoners all put aside their differences to take on a fanatical unit of the Waffen-SS. To understand how such an absurd scenario came together, you have to start with the castle itself. Castle Itter sits on a forested hill near a small village in the North Tyrol region of Austria. Its foundations date back to the 13th century, and over the years it had served as a fortress, a ruin, and eventually a renovated hotel. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the castle was leased from its owner by the German government. Then, in February 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl seized the property outright on the orders of Heinrich Himmler. Within weeks, it was transformed into a special detention facility administered by the Dachau concentration camp system. But Castle Itter wasn't Dachau by any means, and instead it was a gilded cage for high-value French hostages. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud were held there, as were Generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, both former commanders-in-chief of the French army. Tennis star and nationalist politician Jean Barotra was also a captive, and he would play a major role in the battle to come. These were people the Reich considered useful as potential bargaining chips in future negotiations. Conditions were tolerable by wartime standards, but as Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1944 and into 1945, the prisoners began to fear they'd be executed. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was rapidly collapsing, and a steady stream of senior SS officers passed through Castle Itter while fleeing the Allied advance. On April 30th, Eduard Weiter, the last commandant of Dachau, arrived with a retinue of subordinates and their families. Weiter had ordered the execution of roughly 2,000 prisoners before abandoning the camp. His presence terrified the French captives, who were well aware of the massacres at Dachau and feared his arrival foreshadowed their own deaths. But on May 2nd, he was found dead of gunshot wounds in disputed circumstances. Weiter's death rattled Sebastian Wimmer, the castle's commandant, an SS officer who'd grown increasingly uneasy with the situation in Europe. Wimmer apparently assured the French prisoners he wouldn't allow harm to come to them and would even help them escape if necessary, but his nerve didn't hold. Shortly after Weiter's death, Wimmer and the remaining SS guards abandoned Castle Itter entirely, leaving the prisoners in control, but surrounded by hostile territory. The prisoners armed themselves with whatever weapons the fleeing guards had left behind and began planning their own rescue. On May 3rd, they sent Zvonimir Kukovic, a Yugoslav resistance member working as a handyman, to find Allied forces. The nearest town was occupied by German troops, so he pushed 40 miles up the Inn River Valley toward Innsbruck. Late that evening, he reached an advance party of the American 103rd Infantry Division. A rescue force was assembled but was halted by heavy shelling halfway to the castle and then recalled by superiors who determined the operation fell outside their jurisdiction. Back at the castle, the prisoners had no idea whether Kukovic had succeeded, and on May 4th, they sent Andreas Krobat, the castle's Czech cook, toward a local town on a bicycle. Krobat's ride changed everything, because on the road he encountered Major Sepp Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer who'd turned against the regime. He was leading a small band of German soldiers, mostly from Bavaria, working alongside the Austrian resistance. Gangl knew about Castle Itter and had wanted to liberate it, but lacked the manpower. Learning that the guards had fled gave him the opening he needed. Gangl found what he was looking for about 8 miles north. A tank platoon from the 12th Armored Division, led by First Lieutenant Jack Lee. Lee had spent 5 months leading his unit across France, through Germany and into Austria, earning a Bronze Star along the way. His Sherman tank was nicknamed Besotten Jenny, reportedly after one of his soldiers' unfaithful girlfriends. Lee was tired. Everyone was tired. The war was essentially over, and nobody wanted to die in its final hours. But when Gangl laid out the situation, Lee agreed to help. Lee assembled a ragtag convoy, his own tank, a second Sherman, additional armor, some infantrymen, and Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers. They set off on the evening of May 4th to liberate the castle and its prisoners, but a bridge collapsed after the lead tanks crossed, cutting off infantry support. Lee had to leave tanks behind to guard key positions, and by the time the convoy reached Castle Itter, the rescue force had been whittled down substantially. They had the Besotten Jenny, about a dozen Americans, and a handful of Gangl's Germans. At the castle, they were joined by Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an injured Waffen-SS captain who'd been befriended by the French prisoners. The French prisoners were grateful but hardly reassured by the rescue force's size. Lee positioned Besotten Jenny at the main gate, placed his men in defensive positions, and settled in for a siege. He didn't have enough vehicles to evacuate everyone, and moving elderly generals and politicians through SS-patrolled roads would have been more dangerous than staying put. They'd have to hold the position until American reinforcements arrived or more German or Austrian deserters showed up. Unfortunately for them, the Waffen-SS came on the morning of May 5th. Between 100 and 150 troops launched their assault with machine guns, small arms, and at least one anti-tank cannon. Lee had ordered the French prisoners to take cover, but they refused. Former prime ministers, generals, resistance fighters, and a tennis champion picked up weapons and fought alongside the Americans and Germans. The fighting was brutal, and machine gun fire hammered the castle walls, blowing out narrow windows and sending chunks of masonry across the interior courtyard. An anti-tank shell destroyed Gamelin's empty room in the upper floor, and had he taken cover as requested, he would have perished right there. Then a second round slammed into besotten Jenny. Corporal Edward Shimchick barely escaped before the fuel tanks ignited, and the Sherman erupted in flames. The burning wreck of the tank at the main gate, which had been their strongest defensive asset, now served only as a grim beacon. Without its firepower, the defenders were in serious trouble. Ammunition was running low, and SS troops swarmed from the tree line toward the main gate. In the chaos, Major Gangl, the leader of the German defectors, was hit by a sniper's bullet while trying to move former Prime Minister Reynaud out of the line of fire. He perished instantly, the only defender to die that day. His death was a gut punch, but the remaining defenders kept fighting. Lee eventually reached the Austrian resistance by telephone and secured 3 additional fighters who drove to the castle under heavy fire. They needed every man they could get to defend the castle, and thankfully their strong defensive position was a force multiplier, so the 3 additional men punched above their weight. With ammunition nearly gone, Lee needed to get word to the 142nd Infantry Regiment about the severity of the situation. Jean Barotra, the 60-year-old tennis star, volunteered to vault the castle wall and sprint through a hail of bullets to reach American lines. Lee accepted, knowing that desperate times called for desperate measure, and Barotra scaled the wall and ran. Despite his age, the former Wimbledon champion made it through without being hit. He reached the 142nd, delivered Lee's message, and then did something entirely in character. He requested a uniform and a rifle and joined the relief force heading back to the castle. The 142nd arrived at roughly 4 in the afternoon, bringing troops and armor that overwhelmed the remaining SS attackers. The battle was over. Nearly 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner. Every single French captive survived. Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross and was promoted to captain. Schrader, the Waffen-SS defector, was arrested for his former affiliation and sentenced to 2 years in prison, though this was later shortened in recognition of his actions in the fight. It's tempting to treat the Battle of Castle Itter as a curiosity, a weird footnote, but the stakes were higher than they appear. Edouard Daladier and Reynaud had been wartime prime ministers, and Weygand and Gamelin had commanded France's armies. Their survival meant they could contribute to the reconstruction of post-war France and shape its approach to European integration. It's very possible that Major Gangl, heroically sacrificing his life for the lives of his former enemies, may have played an outsized role in the thawing of Franco-German relations. Had the Waffen-SS overrun the castle, French post-war politics could have looked meaningfully different. Major Gangl was posthumously honored as an Austrian national hero, as well as being fairly well known in his home state of Bavaria as well. The story of Castle Itter is a reminder that in the final chaotic hours of the most destructive conflict in human history, people on opposite sides of a war found a reason to stand together. While the battle lasted less than a day and the Second World War was effectively over, it would provide one of the most oddly compelling narratives of the entire conflict. On the morning of December 8, 1941, just hours after Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding on the other side of the Pacific. In the pre-dawn darkness over Hong Kong, waves of Japanese bombers roared across the border from occupied China and obliterated the colony's tiny air force on the ground at Kai Tak Airport. 5 obsolete planes were destroyed in minutes, and the entire aerial defense of a British Crown colony, home to over 1.5 million people, was wiped out. What followed over the next 18 days was one of the most dramatic and lopsided campaigns of the Second World War. It was an assault that ended in Britain's first full colonial surrender to a foreign power since the American Revolution. Hong Kong in late 1941 wasn't supposed to hold, and the British military planners knew it. Winston Churchill himself had called the colony's defense an impossibility as early as January of that year, describing any reinforcement as a waste of resources. This proclamation would, in time, come to blemish Churchill's reputation in one of the most developed corners of the British Empire. The colony sat at the southern tip of China, surrounded on three sides by territory Japan had already seized. It had no strategic depth, no room to maneuver, and no realistic prospect of relief. And yet, in a decision driven more by politics than by military logic, the garrison was reinforced in November 1941. Nearly 2,000 Canadian troops from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada arrived, and most of these soldiers had never seen combat. Some hadn't even completed basic training. They were sailing into a death trap, and nobody in Ottawa seemed to fully grasp what was in store for these Canadians. The Japanese assault was led by Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai, commanding the 38th Division and elements of the 23rd Army. His force numbered roughly 20,000 experienced, battle-hardened troops who'd spent years fighting across China. Opposing them was a garrison of around 14,000 men, a patchwork of British, Canadian, Indian, and local Hong Kong volunteer units, all under Major General Christopher Maltby. The defenders were spread thin across the new territories, Kowloon and Hong Kong Island, trying to cover far too much ground with far too few soldiers. The plan was to hold the Gin Drinkers Line, a series of defensive positions stretching across the new territories. It was modeled loosely on the Maginot Line concept, but it had never been properly completed and was severely undermanned. The line was supposed to hold for at least a week, but it fell in a single night. On December 9th, Japanese forces attacked the Shingmun Redoubt, a key position held by the 2nd Royal Scots Battalion. The redoubt was supposed to be defended by a full company, but like everything else in Hong Kong was undermanned to the extreme. The Japanese infiltrated the tunnels and bunkers under cover of darkness and overwhelmed the defenders in brutal close-quarters fighting. By dawn, the position was lost, and with it any hope of a sustained defense on the mainland. What followed was a fighting retreat across Kowloon. Indian and British troops fell back through the dense urban landscape, demolishing infrastructure as they went. Oil tanks at Lai Chi were set ablaze, sending towers of black smoke over the harbor, and ferries scrambled to evacuate soldiers across Victoria Harbor to Hong Kong Island. By December 13th, just 5 days into the battle, all areas on the mainland had been abandoned, and the defense now rested on the island of Hong Kong itself. According to traditional tactical thought, launching an assault in this sort of situation would have been unthinkable, so negotiations began in earnest. General Sakai sent a formal demand for surrender on December 13th, but Maltby refused. Churchill cabled instructions that there was to be no thought of surrender, and that every part of the island must be fought for. It was a noble sentiment from a man sitting comfortably in London, but it offered no practical solution. The defenders were outgunned, outmanned, and running low on everything from ammunition to clean water. For 4 days, Japanese artillery pounded the island's northern shore from positions in Kowloon. The bombardment was relentless, targeting pillboxes, gun emplacements, and communication lines. Japanese aircraft bombed the island with near impunity, since Hong Kong's anti-aircraft defenses were woefully inadequate. The constant shelling shattered telephone lines, making coordination between units nearly impossible. Defenders were forced to rely on runners, a throwback to First World War tactics that cost precious time and lives. Since Maltby had no aerial reconnaissance of any nature whatsoever, he couldn't be sure what the Japanese were planning next. An amphibious assault would be much more costly for the Japanese, and it appeared that they sought to launch a blitzkrieg in the Pacific. However, the British were also sure that the Japanese knew that the island of Hong Kong was completely isolated and would rapidly be devoid of the necessities of life. Hong Kong couldn't sustain itself on its own, so it was possible that the Japanese would simply settle into a siege until the British forces surrendered. On the night of December 18th, there would be no further doubts when the Japanese launched their amphibious assault on the island. 3 battalions crossed the harbor in small boats, landing on the northeastern shore between North Point and Taiko. Searchlights that were supposed to illuminate the approaching boats had been knocked out by shell fire. Some defensive positions fought ferociously, but the Japanese established a beachhead and pushed inland with terrifying speed. By morning, they'd cut the island's defenses in two, driving a wedge between the forces in the east under Brigadier Cedric Wallace and those in the west under Brigadier John Lawson. The fighting at Wong Nai Chung Gap stands as one of the most desperate episodes of the entire campaign. The gap was a vital mountain pass connecting the north and south sides of the island, and Brigadier Lawson had established his headquarters there. When Japanese forces stormed the position on December 19th, Lawson and his staff found themselves surrounded and fighting for their lives. According to accounts passed down through the brigade, Lawson reportedly told his subordinates that he was going outside to fight it out rather than be captured. He was slain in combat shortly afterward, becoming the highest-ranking Canadian officer to die in combat during the Second World War. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles fought with extraordinary courage in the days that followed. They mounted counterattacks against fortified Japanese positions, despite having no prior combat experience. Company Sergeant Major John Osborne of the Winnipeg Grenadiers would be awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his actions, the only one given for the Hong Kong campaign. The Victoria Cross is the highest award for valor in the British Empire and is essentially the equivalent of the Medal of Honor. And when you hear what he did to win this award, you'll understand exactly why he won it. No questions asked. In an act of extreme heroism, he'd thrown himself on a Japanese grenade, effectively using his body to absorb the blast that would have eliminated a number of his comrades. These soldiers who were defending Hong Kong weren't lacking in bravery in the least. Unfortunately, though, they lacked everything else: training, equipment, leadership at the strategic level, and most of all, a fighting chance. The final week was a grinding, horrifying affair. Japanese forces advanced steadily across the island, capturing reservoir after reservoir and cutting off the water supply. Pockets of resistance held out with remarkable tenacity, particularly around the island's southern tip. But the outcome was never in doubt, and each day brought the defenders closer to collapse as ammunition dwindled and the water situation became critical. The Japanese committed numerous atrocities during the battle's final days. At the Silesian mission on December 19th, wounded soldiers from a field hospital were bayoneted in their beds. At St. Stephen's College on Christmas morning, Japanese troops entered the emergency hospital and targeted the doctors and nurses for slaughter. The logic appears to have been that if the medical professionals were eliminated, the defenders would lose their capacity to fight even faster. These weren't isolated incidents of battlefield frenzy. They formed a pattern of deliberate brutality that would continue and intensify during the years of occupation that followed. And disturbingly, these tactics were highly effective for the Imperial Japanese soldiers, at least in the short run. At 3:15 in the afternoon on December 25, 1941, Governor Sir Mark Young walked into the dining room of the Peninsula Hotel in Kowloon. There he found General Sakai was waiting and signed the instrument of surrender. It was Christmas Day, and for the garrison survivors and the colony's civilian population, it marked the beginning of 3 years and 8 months of Japanese occupation. The British called it Black Christmas, and Hong Kong wouldn't be free again until August 1945, living under conditions that worsened over the course of the war in the Pacific. The battle's toll was staggering for its brevity, and the garrison suffered over 4,000 casualties. Of the nearly 2,000 Canadians who'd arrived just weeks earlier, 290 were dead and 493 wounded. Disturbingly, though, in many cases, those who fell in combat were the lucky ones. Many who survived the fighting wouldn't survive the horrific nature of the Japanese prison camps. Over the next 4 years, another 264 Canadian prisoners died from disease, starvation, forced labor, and execution in camps across Hong Kong and Japan. The Japanese, for their part, suffered roughly 3,000 casualties, a price they considered entirely acceptable for seizing one of Asia's most important ports. Notably, this number was considered exceptionally good for how brazen the attack was, and since they engaged in significant urban fighting and an amphibious landing, it was quite low. The fall of Hong Kong reverberated through the Allied world. Coming alongside the simultaneous disasters at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and Wake Island, it shattered the myth of Western military invincibility in Asia. For Canada, the battle sparked a bitter political controversy that lasted decades, centering on why inadequately trained troops had been sent to a position everyone knew was indefensible. A royal commission investigated after the war, but ultimately assigned no blame, a conclusion that satisfied almost nobody. Ultimately, many Canadians ended up blaming Winston Churchill for shipping these Canadian men to defend the undefendable. They came to believe that he wouldn't have been so careless with British troops from the home island. Many also question why Churchill didn't simply allow the garrison to surrender, perhaps in exchange for safe passage for the men stationed there. This wasn't a glorious final stand that tied up Japanese units, while the Allies were achieving some other goal elsewhere. There was no apparent overall strategic goal to not negotiating a surrender, potentially securing favorable terms for the troops and for Hong Kong itself. Today, the battle's memory lives on in the cemeteries and memorials scattered across Hong Kong. The fall of Hong Kong wasn't the war's largest battle or its most strategically significant, but it remains a powerful reminder of what happens when opaque political calculations override military reality. It also shows exactly what happens when ordinary soldiers are asked to pay the price for decisions made by people who'll never hear a shot fired.